So we had Sony release their financial report to wrap up their fiscal year. This ended March 31st, and it covers all the way back to April 1st of 2022. And turns out Sony had a massive fourth quarter fiscal year, but quarter one for this calendar year, so January to March. And they're very impressive console sales in here, but there's also something maybe a bit strange going on. And I want to go over that here with you guys today. So if you enjoy this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you're new here to the Spawn Wave channel. First, let's head over here. This is their Games Network Services segment for their supplemental information. Basically, Sony puts out an entire PDF roundup of information for investors, and they have this across multiple different forums and stuff on their website. But the part that we mostly care about is for the gaming side. And obviously people wonder how things like the PlayStation 5 is doing in terms of sales for the system. Specifically, how many have they sold? But they do give us a nice breakdown of a bunch of different bits of information here. And the biggest takeaway, and the thing that's really going around right now, is that they had a record-breaking Q1 for the calendar, or Q4 for them. Basically, January to March, it's the most systems that's ever been sold. And that's across Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo, doesn't matter. They sold 6.3 million PlayStation 5s in that beginning 3 months of this calendar year, which is absolutely ridiculous. I think the last system that held that top spot was the PlayStation 2. That was in 2005. So think about that. The PS2, the Wii, the Switch, the DS, none of them sold this many systems in a Q1 for a calendar year ever. So the PS5 is rolling along, and in fact, it ended up beating that 19 million that Sony had forecasted for this fiscal year, and it did not look like it was going to get there. I mean, no one was really expecting 6.3 million units to sell in this. I mean, how would you bet on that when it's legitimately a record-breaking amount, right? So them now reaching 19.1 million systems for the fiscal year puts them, I think, like 2 million units behind the PlayStation 4 launch line, which is incredibly impressive when you consider the overall shortage that we've seen with the PlayStation 5, and a lot of that having to do with the supply chain issues and all this. Seems like Sony is coming out of that, along with Nintendo. There's something going on with Microsoft right now, and apparently they're having a harder time getting systems to store shelves. But at this point, Sony's got it all worked out, and they have a nice flow of systems hitting stores all over the place. And I mean, you can see 19.1 million this fiscal year versus 11.5 million the last fiscal year. And it's really interesting because people have pointed out that while we've had God of War Ragnarok, which was very big for the holidays, this past quarter, so the beginning of this year, nothing really from Sony from a first-party standpoint. That's usually what you think of for these companies to push their hardware. However, Sony is doing something a bit different technically, but it is something that they have had great success with since the beginning of the PlayStation brand in general, and that is to align themselves next to third-party software, whether it's through timed exclusivity, outright exclusivity, or just the marketing rights. So Hogwarts Legacy, massive, obviously, right? I think if you look at their first quarter, you go, I wonder what pushed PlayStation 5 systems. Was it Forspoken, or was it Hogwarts Legacy? Even though Hogwarts Legacy is on other platforms, Sony made it look like time and time again it was only on the PlayStation 5. For the areas that we could see the splits, it was heavily in favor of Sony on their PlayStation system. So Hogwarts Legacy, probably a big driving factor. And then also the pent-up demand and the fact that Sony could finally get PlayStation 5 systems to store shelves, I mean, in mass. All of this built up to, again, a record-breaking quarter for them. Now, their software was down a bit, actually, this past quarter. If you compare their Q4 of this past fiscal year to the previous fiscal year, it was 68 versus 70.5, so down, what, like 3 or 4%. Not a massive drop-off, but typically, as you build your install base, you want to also be building up your overall software sales, because that's where you make basically all of the money for the most part, right? Even though they sold a ton of systems, technically when they see their operating income and stuff, it doesn't jump as dramatically as it would if their software was just absolutely crushing. So the only thing you can really look at and say, okay, from a game standpoint, they've mentioned that, oh, the reasoning for this was less third-party releases than we would have expected. And we see a lot of delays happening and different things that are going on that maybe things fell out of this past quarter into the second quarter or the third quarter, or just even delayed into next year. So as things have been moving around, so have the results in terms of sales for Sony. Now let's talk about what Sony's looking to do going into this current fiscal year that we're in now that started April 1st. And the biggest thing here is they are pushing for 25 million PlayStation 5 systems to ship out or sell or whatnot. And that would be the most they've ever done in history for the PlayStation brand. And that's very impressive now in a space where we see things like the hybrid model Switch that obviously has a clear functionality to it as opposed to just games. And this being just a set-top box that you put under your TV, 25 million would be very, very impressive. And I'll be curious to see if they can make that happen. But they have gone on record to say Spider-Man 2 will be coming out this fiscal year. I still believe it's on track for this fall or this holiday. And even though they will have that, which Spider-Man 2, we all know, it's going to sell incredibly well, right? Like, it's not a shocker when they come out and announce, millions and millions have sold in the first week, the first few days or something. It's Spider-Man. But still, nonetheless, looking forward with their forecast here, they still mention that there will be an impact of decrease in sales of first-party titles. Now, that would be this current fiscal year versus last fiscal year, where God of War Ragnarok was the big anchor for them, but still, they had other games. And then you look at Spider-Man 2, you kind of feel like that should match up well enough versus Ragnarok to kind of even that out. And I'm thinking about this. We have third-party games coming up from them. And that, again, that's the big thing that Sony is doing. Final Fantasy 16, it's not from Sony. That's a third-party game. Doesn't play into the first-party titles. Silent Hill 2, same thing. Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth. We assume that is going to come out this fiscal year. Remember, that extends to March 31st. And Square's gone on record to say winter, so that could be February, for example, next. It could even be March, and it would still fit into the fiscal year. Instead, what I'm kind of wondering here is if this means we can expect a couple of those live service games to still release and they be free to play, because then there would be no upfront cost, right? And I feel like Sony will show up with free-to-play titles as part of their live service offering, since they're going to scattershot this thing and have 8 to 10 or something to look forward to here. And some may be premium priced. Others may legitimately just be you hit a few buttons and you download it and you have it on your system free of charge, really, to follow up with, of course, all kinds of microtransactions to get more money from you. Now, that's not to say they won't have anything else outside of just Spider-Man 2 as like a premium priced first-party game. They could have something a bit smaller maybe that comes out that they don't have massive sales expectations for. Think of something that might line up alongside of a Returnal, for example. They didn't exactly release Returnal thinking this is going to sell 10 million copies. It got out there. The last reported number that I think we got was 500,000 or 600,000 copies. They actually have that in their report here with last reported sales. So if they come up with something like that, then it would still kind of play into the idea of there being a decrease in sales of first-party titles. And I think it's also interesting to point out here that they do mention acquisitions, once again, actually even pointing out Bungie, but that they will be increasing approximately 20% year on year to be 65 billion yen. So people are once again thinking, okay, are they going to look to make some other acquisitions? Maybe stuff similar to what they've done here with Firewalk and what we've seen with Haven. I'm kind of thinking Deviation Games that's almost a lock at this point, especially if they're developing a live service game for Sony. If they believe in it and they think it could run 6 or 7 years of support, they'll probably look to acquire Deviation. That might be part of this 20% jump in acquisition budget. Oh, and there's something else that's kind of missing from this entire fiscal year report, and that's the PlayStation VR 2. People were curious about how this thing's been doing, as about 5 or 6 weeks would be included in this report since it released right at the end of February. but they didn't mention it at all. They just kind of glossed over it, walked right past it, and generally that means they don't have much to brag about. And because VR in general is still a fairly niche sector in all of entertainment, it's not going to look as impressive next to something like, oh yeah, we sold like over 6 million PlayStation 5 systems this past quarter, and oh yeah, here we sold like a couple 100,000 PSVR 2 headsets that we spent a lot of time and money R&Ding. It's going to be something they may talk about down the road, maybe when they get into the millions sold for PSVR 2. So not great news, not bad news, at least out of the gate for their VR headset. And I guess now the question will be, can they get back on track as they have shown with this previous quarter and deliver 25 million PlayStation 5 systems this current fiscal year? Because if they do, they will jump well ahead of the PlayStation 4. And it sounds weird, but at that point, depending on what software they have upcoming then, when we get to, we'll say, April 2024, we might start thinking about them maybe running down something like the PlayStation 2. It sounds weird, like I said, but hey, the PS5 has massive momentum right now. The PlayStation brand is incredibly strong, and Jim Ryan, while he gets made fun of a lot online, I know, he seems to know what he's doing right now, at least with that PlayStation brand, and we'll see how he navigates this upcoming year, especially when they start talking about those live service games, because as we've seen with the live service sector, sometimes it's a roll of the dice and you end up with a bit of a dud, and that can actually hurt you pretty badly, especially shake confidence. But we'll see what they have cooking up here, especially as we get into May, when I'm expecting the next 4 weeks to probably have some sort of announcement around a showcase that should really line up and really set up the next 12 to even 24 months for Sony. But let me know what you guys think about all of this down below, with them breaking a big-time record for the first quarter, topping some of the most popular systems with the Wii, the Switch, the DS, the PS2, with systems shipped out to retailers and consumers. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.